Hello, this is Rabbi David Abramson. This week's Torah portion is Parashat Re'eh. I'd like to begin our exploration of Parashat Re'eh by posing a simple question. Does Judaism expect us to be vegetarians? I know many Jewish vegetarians, and it seems to me that for many of them, Jewish values are among the primary reasons for their being vegetarian. And so the question is a compelling one. Does Judaism expect us to be vegetarians? And so our exploration of this question begins with two verses in our Torah portion. Ki yarchiv Adonai Elohecha et gevulcha ka'asher diber lach. When Adonai your God has enlarged your border as God promised you, v'amarta ochla vasar, and you say, I will eat meat, ki ta'aven nafshecha le'echol basar, because your soul desires to eat meat, v'chol avat nafshecha tochal basar. Then, as your soul desires, you may eat meat. So maybe this is the end of the discussion. Are we allowed to eat meat? The Torah's answer appears clear. Yes, we are. But of course, there's more. Ki yirchak mimecha hamakom, when you are far away from the place, asher yivchar Adonai Elohecha lasum shemo sham, which Adonai your God has chosen to establish God's name, v'zavachta mibukaracha umitzonecha asher natan Adonai lacha, then you may slaughter animals from your herd and your flock, which Adonai has given you, ka'asher tziviticha, in the way I have commanded you. V'achalta bish'arecha, and you may eat within your gates, v'chol avat nafshecha, as your soul desires. This verse seems to be amplifying what the previous verse said. Yes, you may eat meat, v'chol avat nafshecha, as your soul desires. But of course, it's not that simple. So let's take a little journey through biblical and rabbinic texts and see what we find. Let's go back to the beginning, to the first chapter in Genesis. Vayomer Elohim, God said, in this case, God said to Adam, Hine natati lachem et kol esev zorea zera, behold, I have given you every seed-bearing plant, asher al panei chol haaretz, which is upon the face of the earth, yet kol eitz asher bo free eitz zorea zara, and every tree that has seed-bearing fruit, lachem yihyeh le'ochla, to you it shall be for food. Ulchol chayat haaretz, ulchol of hashamayim, and to all the inhabitants on land, and to all the birds of the sky, ulchol romeis al haaretz asher bo nefesh chaya, and to everything that creeps on earth, in which there is the breath of life, et kol yerek esev l'ochla vayhichein. I have given all the green plants for food, and it was so. Here too, the text seems clear. God tells Adam that God has created all of these seed-bearing plants and the fruits of seed-bearing plants, that is, fruits and vegetables, for food, and that God has provided this food for human beings and for all of the animals as well. But Adam isn't told, I created these animals for you to eat, just I've created fruits and vegetables for you to eat. On the other hand, look at what God subsequently tells Noah. Kol remes asher hu chai, every moving thing that lives, lachem yihyeh le'ochla, you may eat. Ki yerek esev natati lachem et kol, just like the green herbs, I have given you all. Ach basar b'nafsho damo lo tochelu, but the meat with its life in it, which is its blood, you shall not eat. So Adam is told, here are the fruits and vegetables that I created for you. And Noah is told, you may eat meat. This leads many commentators to conclude that in the perfect world of the Garden of Eden, people were permitted to eat only fruits and vegetables, while in the imperfect world after Noah and the flood, people were permitted to eat meat. The Talmud underscores this point with a little additional textual analysis. Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Rav. Rav Yehuda said in Rav's name, Adam Harishon lo hutar lo basar la'achila. Adam was not permitted to eat meat. Dichtiv lachem yihyeh la'ochla. For it is written, behold, I have given you every seed-bearing plant, etc. To you it shall be for food. Lachem yihyeh la'ochla is the last phrase in verse 29. The Gemara now continues with the first phrase from the next verse. Ulchol chayat haaretz, and to all the animals on land implies v'lo chayat haaretz lachem, but the animals on land shall not be for you, for food that is. The verse does say you may eat fruits and vegetables, suggesting you may eat only fruits and vegetables, but it doesn't explicitly say you may not eat meat. But the rabbis hear a pun, or at least I hear a pun, ulchol chayat haaretz, and to all the animals on land, sounds like v'lo chayat haaretz, but not the animals on land. In any event, the Talmud continues, Uchsheba'u b'nei Noach heitir lahem. But with the advent of the descendants of Noah, eating meat was permitted. Shene'emar ki yerek esev natati lachem et kol. For it is said, just like the green herbs that I had previously permitted you to eat, I have given you all. So it's clear to the rabbis that Adam was expected to be a vegetarian, while Noah and the rest of us, Noah's descendants, are not required to be vegetarians. End of discussion for some Jews. For other Jews, the presentation of vegetarianism in the ideal world serves as a presentation of the ideal of vegetarianism. Judaism might not require us to be vegetarians, but perhaps it is trying to lead us in that direction. And as I said, many Jewish vegetarians do feel that at least part of their commitment to vegetarianism is influenced by this classical Jewish encouragement of vegetarianism. But wait, there's more. Ish ish mi beit Yisrael asher yishchat shor o cheves o eiz b'machaneh. If anyone of the house of Israel slaughters an ox or sheep or goat in the camp, o asher yishchat michutz lamachaneh, or does so outside the camp, v'el petach ohel moed lo hevio, and does not bring it to the entrance of the tent of meeting, lahakriv korban ladonai lifnei mishkan Adonai, to offer it as a sacrifice before Adonai at the altar of Adonai, dam yechashev laish hahu, blood guilt shall be imputed to that man, dam shafach, he has shed blood, v'nichrat ha'ish hahu mikerav amo, that man shall be cut off from among his people. And that clap of thunder that you just heard was completely coincidental. Remember that the religion of Israel, that which evolved eventually into what we call Judaism, emerged in a world of sacrifices. Ancient Near Eastern pagans made offerings to their gods, and the Israelites made offerings of agricultural products and livestock to our God. This passage from Leviticus discusses a particular offering known as a Zevach Shlamim, a peace offering, and here's the procedure. The animal would be dedicated as a sacrifice. The Kohen, the priest, would slaughter the animal according to a specific procedure. Parts of the animal would be burnt on the altar, burnt to smoke and ash, metaphorically consumed by God. Parts of the animal would go to the priests as their portion. That's one of the ways that the community supported the Levitical priests. The remainder could be eaten by the individual or family who had brought the offering. The symbolism of this is clear, sharing a meal with God. But according to this passage in Leviticus, we are allowed to eat meat that was part of such a sacrificial meal. On the other hand, secular slaughtering of animals was strictly forbidden, and with particularly strong language. But now we return to those verses from our Torah portion. When Adonai your God has enlarged your border as God promised you, and you say, I will eat meat, because your soul desires to eat meat, then as your soul desires, you may eat meat. When you are far away from the place which Adonai your God has chosen to establish God's name, then you may slaughter animals from your herd and your flock, which Adonai has given you, in the way I have commanded you. And you may eat within your gates as your soul desires. So here we see a broadening of the permission to eat meat. In Leviticus, we're permitted to eat meat only in conjunction with a sacrificial meal. But here in Deuteronomy, we're permitted to eat meat even not related to sacrificial rituals. There's a practical reason for this loosening of the restriction. When the Israelites are wandering together in the desert, it's easier to limit meat eating to those rituals. However, once the Israelites are established in the Holy Land, spread out throughout the land, it will be more burdensome to maintain these restrictions. Eventually, the sacrificial system will be centralized in Jerusalem, and King Solomon will build the Beit HaMikdash, the temple in Jerusalem. So this easing of the restriction has a practical benefit. But I think there's something else going on here. First, God was more restrictive, then God was less restrictive. Now think of that dynamic while I reread the verse in a tone of voice that might sound familiar to anyone who has raised children or who has been raised by people who raised children. When Adonai your God has enlarged your border as God promised you, and you say, I will eat meat, because your soul desires to eat meat, then as your soul desires, you may eat meat. When you are far away from the place which Adonai your God has chosen to establish God's name, then you may slaughter animals from your herd and your flock which Adonai has given you in the way I have commanded you, and you may eat within your gates as your soul desires. Okay, fine. You want it so badly? Go ahead. Eat within your gates as your soul desires. You can almost hear God's sarcasm. You can almost hear God's annoyance in this grudging permission. Go ahead. I'm not going to forbid it, but don't think that it's perfectly all right, because it's not. Perhaps this grudging permission is here to challenge us to confront the moral ambiguity of eating meat. It's not forbidden, but it's not perfectly all right either. And if I'm going to choose to eat meat, I have to be reminded of that moral ambiguity. But still, there's more. Let's take a look at the middle of verse 21. V'zavachta mibekarecha umitzonecha asher natan Adonai lecha. Then you may slaughter animals from your herd and your flock which Adonai has given you, ka'asher tziviticha, in the way I have commanded you. And the last phrase, ka'asher tziviticha, in the way I have commanded you. In the home I grew up in, my father's study was lined with bookshelves, and exploring those bookshelves was an interesting experience in many ways. Once when I was a teenager, I came across a book among his textbooks from veterinary medical school that was this thick. It was a book about shechita, Jewish ritual slaughter. And though I never did more than leaf through a few pages of the book, I was amazed that it was so large a book. Of course, the laws of Jewish ritual slaughter are extensive and complicated. Being a shochet, a ritual slaughterer, or even a rabbinic supervisor of ritual slaughter is a super specialty beyond the expertise of most rabbis. And as extensive as this area of Jewish law is, its biblical basis, that is, its basis in the Torah shebichtav, in the written Torah, is this: Ka'asher tziviticha, as I have commanded you. All of the extensive and complicated law related to Jewish ritual slaughter is based on that one short phrase in the Torah shebichtav, in the written Torah. Of course, there's a lot more to shechita, to Jewish ritual slaughter, as part of the broader Jewish dietary laws that we can learn from. In a moment, I'll share a passage from the pen of Rav Kook. Rabbi Avraham Yitzchak Kook, the spiritual and intellectual giant of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, was the first Ashkenazi chief rabbi of the contemporary Jewish community in the Holy Land. He was also, by the way, a vegetarian, based, I believe, on that ideal of vegetarianism presented in Genesis 1. Rav Kook writes the following about shechita, Jewish ritual slaughter. The act of slaughter, shechita, must be sanctified in a unique manner, as I have commanded you, with a minimum of pain to the animal. That's one aspect of shechita with which many of us are familiar. Jewish ritual slaughter is intended to be the fastest method of killing an animal, therefore the least painful to the animal, therefore the most humane. But shechita is concerned with more than simply the welfare of the animal. Jewish law is also concerned with the person who slaughters the animal and that person's sensitivity to that animal. Rav Kook continues, thus the person will take to heart the fact that this is a sentient being. He is not involved with a random object that moves about like an automaton, but with a living, feeling creature. He must become attuned to its senses, even to its emotions, to the feeling it has for the life of its family members, and to its compassion for its own offspring. The challenge to the shochet, in addition to his technical skills, is his cultivated sensitivity to the lives of the animal that he takes. If he is going to take animal life so that people can eat meat, he must try to be sensitive to that life. But you and I don't slaughter animals for food. But those of us who choose to eat meat benefit from somebody else slaughtering animals for food. That person's sensitivity should be important to us. And when we eat kosher meat, and when we think about eating kosher meat, that awareness of the life that was taken, that respect for the life that was taken, should be part of our consciousness. But remember that Judaism doesn't require vegetarianism. Judaism doesn't forbid us from eating meat. And Judaism is not bashful about telling us no. In the area of food alone, Judaism tells us that certain foods are forbidden to us always, other foods are permitted to us, but forbidden to be consumed together with certain other foods. Certain foods we're forbidden from eating during Pesach, and other foods we avoid during the period of semi-mourning preceding Tisha B'Av. Judaism is not bashful about telling us no, and it doesn't forbid us from eating meat. As a matter of fact, there are some classical sources that encourage the eating of meat. The Talmud tells us, "Bizman shebeit hamikdash kayam ein simcha ela babasar." When the temple was in existence, there could be no rejoicing without meat. Shene'emar v'zavachta shalamim v'achalta sham v'samachta lifnei Adonai Elohecha. As it is said, and you shall sacrifice there offerings of well-being and eat them, rejoicing before Adonai your God. Ah, there's that zevach shlamim, that metaphorical sharing a meal with God. The Talmud continues, Ve'achshav she'ein bein hamikdash kayam, ein simcha ela bayayin. But now that the temple is no longer in existence, there is no rejoicing without wine. Shene'emar, as it is said in the book of Psalms, the yain yisamach levav enosh, wine gladdens the heart of man. When the temple existed, meat was indispensable to any happy occasion. Today we have wine or grape juice at every simcha, a wedding, a baby naming, every major holiday, of course Shabbat, because of the symbolic association between wine and joy. Kiddush, the sanctification of Shabbat, is recited over a cup of wine or grape juice to toast the joy of Shabbat. Shabbat is all about joy and delight. As the prophet Isaiah said, V'karata la Shabbat oneg, you shall call the Sabbath a delight. According to Jewish tradition, Shabbat is not only an opportunity for oneg, for delight, we are commanded to call the Sabbath a delight. And so in his Mishnah Torah, his code of Jewish law, Moses Maimonides writes, Achilat basar ushtiyat yayin b'Shabbat oneg hula, eating meat and drinking wine on Shabbat is a form of oneg, of delight for a person, v'hu shahayata yado maseget, provided this is within his financial capacity. Or to put it another way, we're obligated to enhance our enjoyment of Shabbat with meat and wine, at least as much as we're able to afford. I want to conclude our exploration of these texts with a story about Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi. Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, the chief rabbi of the Jewish community at the beginning of the 3rd century of the Common Era, edited the Mishnah and had it committed to writing. He is one of the most important figures in all of rabbinic history. When the Talmud refers to him simply as Rabbi, nobody has to ask which Rabbi they're talking about. Despite his illustrious life, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi suffered from terrible medical maladies later in his life, including painful and debilitating gastrointestinal symptoms. There's a beautifully poignant story about Rabbi's deathbed vigil, in which the angels are praying for his ascent to heaven, while his students are praying for his recovery. When his devoted housekeeper sees how much he is suffering, she changes her prayer and prays that he will be relieved of his suffering. But why did Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi suffer so much? Here's an explanation from the Talmud. Dehahu egla dahavu ka metato le lishchita. A calf was being taken to the slaughter. Azal talaya l'reishei v'chanfei de Rabbi v'kabechi. When it broke away, hit its head under Rabbi's clothes, and cried. Amar le, he said to it, Zil, lechach notzarta, go, for this you were created. Amrei, they in heaven said, U'il v'la kamerachem, since he has no pity, litu ale yisurim, let us bring suffering upon him. The tragic lesson for Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, sensitivity to living things is important. Even living things that will soon be slaughtered for our food. I'm not a vegetarian, but I struggle with vegetarianism, as I think we all should. Like most of you who eat meat, I eat a lot less meat today than I did when I was younger. When we were children, meat was a more prominent part of what was considered a healthy American diet. But I eat less meat today because we know more about the health hazards associated with red meat. I also eat less meat today because it's expensive. I also eat less meat today because I'm aware of, and I hope sensitive to, the natural resources considerations related to meat consumption and meat production, including pollution considerations and the amount of food required to raise cattle for beef. We human beings are carbon-based life forms, and we sustain our lives by consuming carbon-based life forms and things produced by carbon-based life forms. But which carbon-based life forms, which formerly living things we consume, that's a complicated question, and that's an important question. Judaism tries to sensitize us to all living things, and so it regulates our relationships with our fellow human beings. It regulates our relationships with animals, in this area, the area of food and other areas, and it regulates our relationships with plant life as well. Judaism does not require me to be a vegetarian, but still I struggle with the moral ambiguity of eating meat. Judaism offers an ethical compromise between vegetarianism on the one hand and unthinking, unfeeling, callous meat eating on the other hand. We live in a world of many ethical gray areas, and Judaism challenges me to confront this gray area and perhaps others as a result. But still, I struggle with it all. And so Judaism offers me not only an ethical compromise regarding vegetarianism, but an experiential context in which to confront these issues, to confront the moral ambiguity of eating meat, to remind me of the lives that are taken in order for me to sustain my life, to sensitize me to all life in the miraculous world in which we live, and to help me continue to find my place in God's world. Shabbat Shalom.